Have you ever reached a turning point in your life where you decided to make a change? I'm not necessarily talking about leaving your past completely behind you and setting off on something entirely new and different. Maybe just a small but deliberate change of plan. I recently read something about someone who did this, and I thought it was really interesting. I'm sure many of you will know who Glen Gould is. I don't think I'm going too far out on a limb to say that most of us here are in the CBC radio demographic. At CBC's headquarters in Toronto, they have a concert hall called the Glen Gould Studio, which is pretty fitting since Gould was a giant in Canadian classical music. Even calling him a giant seems like an understatement. I remember Oscar Peterson, the world-famous Canadian jazz pianist, was once asked why he never performed classical music, and Peterson said that with Glen Gould around, why would anyone else even try? So perhaps some of you may already know, but it was certainly news to me until recently, that Glen Gould, the child prodigy and world-famous pianist, decided to stop playing live performances entirely at the age of 31. After that, he only performed in studio recordings and in radio and television programs, many of which he produced himself. Gould gave his first public performance at age 5. His first performance with the Toronto Symphony was at age 13. His first solo concert was at age 15. By all accounts, Gould was a brilliant concert performer, but at age 31, he gave that up, choosing instead to perform only on recordings. To be sure, his recordings and media were just as impressive as his live performances. Gould moved from strength to strength. But what strikes me is that he made such a significant and deliberate change in his direction. Gould didn't especially like performing for a live audience. He thought it limited his ability to express himself. Still, how many of us, given the kind of success that Gould enjoyed to that point, would have the chutzpah to say, I'm never doing that anymore. I'm only going to do this instead from now on. Gould took what I think was a pretty courageous decision to set out in a bold new direction. Who would do this? Why would you do this? Well, funny I should ask. It just so happens that this week our Parsha, Bechuchotai, has something to say about this very question. Bechuchotai is the last portion in the book of Leviticus. When we finish reading it tomorrow morning, we'll say, according to our tradition, Chazak, Chazak, Venit Chazek, be strong, and we will strengthen one another as we move from strength to strength, just like Glen Gould. The portion includes Leviticus chapter 26, which reviews a lot of the blessings and curses which God promised to the Israelites in the wilderness. It certainly seems like we've been getting a lot of curses ourselves in recent times, but we do remain hopeful because of Adonai's faithfulness to our people and the promise that God's covenant with us will always be remembered. Our portion also talks about votive offerings and how they should be in proportion to one's ability to afford them. Being Solel's current treasurer, it's tempting to focus on this part of our portion, but I won't, except to point out that you should all have received your membership financial support packages in your inboxes yesterday. And if you haven't already, I hope that you'll take a look at them soon. Your ongoing support of Solel is vitally important and very much appreciated. So, if not these important subjects, what else does our portion talk about that I will be focusing on? The answer is the Jubilee Year. This subject was introduced last week in Parshat Bahar, but in Bechuchotai is where we get the fine print about exactly how holdings are redeemed in the Jubilee Year, including exceptions for more complicated scenarios, like when land is donated to the temple by someone who bought it from its rightful owner. So what is the Jubilee Year? Let's recap. Every 50 years, God commands us to take a breath, a break, and undertake a kind of reset. Why 50 years in particular? In a sense, the Jubilee is a kind of super sabbatical. Every 7th year is a sabbatical year where we let the land rest. After 7 sabbaticals, we get to 49 years, and then comes the 50th year, the Jubilee Year. Not only do we continue to let the land rest in a Jubilee year, but we also forgive many kinds of debts and return property to its original owners. The 50th year is a kind of reset, a fresh start. It seems pretty extraordinary, maybe even extreme. It certainly doesn't seem realistic in our modern capitalistic society. How can you go about buying and selling things knowing that you have to give them back to their original owners in the 50th year? For that matter, how do you manage to eat when you have to leave the land fallow for 2 years in a row? The short answer is that you have to take a leap of faith. God's command to our ancestors was to observe the Jubilee year, and God's promise was that it would work out okay in the end. All right, maybe we could see a couple of years of bumper crops in advance of the next Jubilee year and feel pretty confident that we'll be able to make it through a couple of fallow years. But what about forgiving debts, freeing indentured servants, and giving back land? That's a lot of disruption without necessarily having a line of sight to how it's all going to work out. Nevertheless, God commands us to have faith and to do it anyway. God's promise is that even though there may be a leap of faith and some disruption, God's blessings will keep on coming and everything will be better in the end. Thinking about the kind of courage God expects us to show in order to observe the Jubilee year reminds me of the kind of courage that Glen Gould had in order to make the decision to stop doing what he was famous for, public performances, and to strike out in a new direction, going from strength to strength. So here we are, in Solel's 50th year. Does God expect us to hit the reset button? At Solel, we've built a strong community over the past 50 years. We saw it last Shabbat as 3 generations of Solelniks showed how incredibly well they've built up and passed on our Jewish traditions right here on this bima. We saw it a week ago tonight as we celebrated 50 years of people coming together to build a thriving community. We have a proud and strong tradition that we built here at Solel. What are we going to do to go from strength to strength? Now, I'm not going to bury the lead. The answer is, don't ask me, I'm just the treasurer. But I will say this, I know that whatever it's going to be, we will all figure this out together. What I also know is that by ordaining the Jubilee year, God is instructing us, challenging us to think hard about how far we've come and where we need to go from here. These days, especially here in Canada, we live in an information economy, or maybe a service economy or a resource economy. For very few of us anymore is it an agrarian economy. For our ancestors, though, more people were involved in farming than not. Let's think about that and think about what the Jubilee year would mean back in those days. Even today, farming is backbreaking work over long days, weeks, and months, but how much more so would it have been in ancient times? God ordains a Jubilee year that follows a sabbatical year. That's 2 straight years of fallow fields. If you're a farmer, that's a lot of time when you're not doing all of the things you usually do. It's a lot of time to sit and think, and it's a lot of time to spend putting your trust in God that everything is going to work out, without you having to do all of the things that you usually do to control your own situation. It's so hard to imagine, especially for us in our modern late-stage capitalist society, not just slowing down, but hitting the reset button and giving up a lifetime's accumulation of achievements. Why does God demand this of us? Maybe sometimes, in order to be able to see how to make things even better, you have to break out of your well-worn habits. We all know habits are hard to break. It can take something really drastic to make it happen. Something like farmers leaving their land fallow for 2 straight years. What did our ancestors do with all that time? What should we be doing here at Solel now that we've reached our 50th anniversary? How are we going to go from the strength of our first 50 years to a new strength in our next 50 years? It's a tough question, and there aren't going to be easy answers, but I do know that God tells us we need to figure it out every 50 years or so. To be clear, I'm not talking about forsaking the accomplishments of the past. Glen Gould didn't decide at age 31 to stop making music, and we aren't going to decide to stop doing all of the things that make Solel the community that it's become and that we all love. Glen Gould did make a conscious and deliberate decision to keep making music, but in a way that he knew would be even better than ever before. In our first 50 years, we helped address the growing problem of food insecurity by working with our interfaith partners to establish Food Path, now Food Banks Mississauga. We worked with our partners to combat homelessness by establishing Pathway. And we've helped to settle refugees from war-torn countries, amongst many, many other important works of Tikkun Olam. The Jubilee Year is a time to reset and to rededicate ourselves to a new direction. What are we going to set our minds to in the next 50 years? In what ways are we going to work together to continue making Solel a light to the nations? As a congregation, we've been doing a pretty great job of meeting the needs of the Jewish community here in the Western GTA, but God is challenging us to go from strength to strength. What are we going to do differently in order to improve our accessibility and our inclusivity? What are we going to do to get even better at reaching out and staying connected with people who in the past may have drifted away? How are we going to adapt to changing social pressures and people's evolving needs for spiritual and cultural connection? How are we collectively going to rise to these challenges? In order to stay as relevant in our next 50 years as we've been in our first 50 years, we're going to have to hit the reset button, or at least give it a gentle tap. What's that going to look like for Solel and Solelniks? I'm not sure, but whatever it turns out to be, I know it's something that we all need to work on together. And I look forward to taking that journey with you. Chazak, chazak, v'nitchazek. Shabbat shalom.